In 1951, something remarkable happened. The piston-engine Avro Lincolns, those venerable old crates that had soldiered on since 1945, were finally being replaced by this, the English Electric Canberra, Britain's first operational jet bomber, built by a company better known for locomotives and refrigerators. Designed by a team working out of a Preston garage, and the pilots who transitioned to her from the plodding Lincolns, well, they thought she was a rather splendid kite. Hello and welcome to Aviation Republic, and if you're new to the channel, my name is Joe and I'm definitely not AI. Well, not with my accent anyway. This is the second part of the Canberra story. In part 1 we covered the whole development saga, how this aircraft was born, the near impossible engineering challenges, the engine crises, the organisational warfare that nearly ended the program. If you haven't seen it, the link's in the description, but you don't need to have watched it for this episode, because this part is all about what happened after the Canberra entered service. The operational story, the combat story, the story of an aircraft that fought in wars on nearly every continent, from the scorching deserts of Egypt to the freezing cold of the South Atlantic, from the nuclear test sites of Christmas Island to breaking records that still stand today. A machine that served longer than almost any military aircraft in history and longer than most of us have been knocking about. This has been one of the most enjoyable, satisfying and at times quite emotional stories I have researched. I really do hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it. But before we get into the adventures of the Canberra, a quick aside. Now, for those who know me, know I love a good aircraft cutaway. I could lose hours in those things, but even I have my limits. After a while, the lines start to blur and my eyes go a bit funny. So when that happens, I like to unwind with a bit of pew-pew on the console, sitting in my favourite spot. Problem is, my favourite spot is here, here, and here, and consoles aren't exactly portable. And mobile games, honestly, I've never been a fan. Too fiddly, too boring, and always shaking you down for cash just to stand a chance. However, I've been playing this game lately that's actually caught me a bit off guard. It's got proper strategy, attention to detail, a bit of planning and just enough luck to keep things interesting. Right now I'm fighting my way through the ranks, mixing and matching characters and chasing better gear, and just in time they brought back the ultimate Death Knight. And he's an absolute tank. He shields your team, redirects damage and even heals himself when enemies heal. Basically the sort of chap who makes everyone else look braver by standing in front of them. In short, a pain for anyone on the other side. And you can grab him free with the promo code UDKING. Now, you've probably guessed the game is Raid Shadow Legends, and yes, like I mentioned, mobile games do want your money. But I've been playing for weeks without spending a penny and I'm doing just fine. If you want to give Raid Shadow Legends a go, download through my link or scan the QR code. As a new player, you get 2 epics, Ultimate Galek from the start and Zargala at level 15. Plus, you can also pick one of 6 promo codes for a legendary champion of your own choice: Green Warden Ruark, Alistair Wanderer, Tuhanarak, Sun Wukong, Tolin Foulbeard and Ultimate Death Knight. I'm grinding towards starting a clan if anyone wants to join. Look for Aviation Joe, I'm almost there. So a huge thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for keeping the tea, biscuits and museum trips flowing. I want you to imagine this. It's a fine spring morning, the day is the 25th of May 1951, and up to this point you've spent your entire career flying lumbering, outdated piston engine bombers. Then, without warning, you hear an unfamiliar whine grown ever louder. Curious as to what could be making that sound, you and your crewmates rush outside and peer up into the sky to see an unfamiliar aircraft performing loops and rolls above your base. What on earth could this be? After a few minutes of staring open-mouthed, the machine comes into land and taxis to a halt in front of your group. Whining engine shut down and out jumps English Electric's test pilot, Roland Beaumont. Once you've all settled, he gathers you all to sit on the grass outside the squadron offices to talk to you about your new mount. And as with anyone who has a keen interest in all things that fly, you listen intently. Beaumont points to this fantastic beauty behind him and explains, "Gentlemen, this is the English Electric Canberra B2. This is your introduction to Britain's first jet-powered bomber, and 101 Squadron, your squadron, based at RAF Binbrook, is at the front of the queue for this new aircraft." He goes on to explain that the B2 is powered by two Rolls-Royce Avon Mark I turbojet engines. Later you find out they're also referred to as the RA3, each putting out 6,500 pounds of thrust and were the latest and greatest engines in the world. You do a quick bit of math. Your old Lincolns with their four trusty Merlin engines churned out roughly 7,000 horsepower that got the old crate up to a top speed of 310 miles an hour. But the Canberra, with just two Avon engines, now you had more than double that, the equivalent of 17,000 horsepower that could get you up to a top speed of 580 miles an hour. You can feel your belly rumbling in excitement. 580 miles an hour. Well, jolly good show. As you walked around the Canberra, you appreciated that she wasn't as large as the Lincoln and definitely not as large as the Washingtons, measuring just 65 feet 6 inches long with a wingspan of 63 feet 11 inches and hauling a 10,000 pound payload. These were respectable figures for a medium bomber. But what made the B2 special wasn't its size, it was what it could do with that size. The enormous wing chord and efficient aerodynamics gave it range and endurance that surprised everyone who flew it, and the low wing loading that had made Roland Beaumont's aerobatic display that morning possible. When Beaumont had finished his chat, Binbrook's commander, Group Captain Wally Sheen, said to Beaumont, "There's one more thing before lunch. I'm going to fly it." He was told that the B2 was not dual control, to which Sheen said it wouldn't be a problem and Beaumont could sit in the jump seat and show him what's what. And so the very first Canberra conversion flight in Bomber Command, just impromptu and unplanned. Starting the engines, however, was less than elegant. The Avons used a Rolls-Royce turbo starter initiated by pyrotechnic cartridges, which meant that every single engine start resulted in plumes of ugly black smoke that announced their presence to everyone within a considerable radius, as you can see here in the video. Here are some photos of a cartridge holder and exhaust vent. It was functional, but it wasn't subtle, and ground crews quickly learned to stand well clear when the cartridges were fired. The crew of the B2 had been bumped up from 2 to 3 from the original design, still quite a reduction from the 7 in the Lincoln, with the pilot sitting up front under a large goldfish bowl style canopy that gave excellent visibility but also made the cabin uncomfortably hot in direct sunlight, something that would be remembered by every pilot who flew a summer sortie. Interestingly, while I was crawling around inside the PR3, it was indeed incredibly warm while sitting in the pilot's seat, but surprisingly cool laying down in the nose or sitting in the coal hole where the navigator would have sat side by side with the bomb aimer. The bomb aimer's station was a particularly distinctive and quite comfortable prone position in the glazed nose section where he could operate the T2 optical bomb sight, peering down through a clear perspex window to visually line up bombing runs. Obviously, as you can see here, time and weather have taken their toll. The T2 optical bomb sight wasn't the sophisticated H2S Mark IX radar system that designer Teddy Petter had originally designed the aircraft around, but it worked, and more importantly, it existed, which was more than could be said for the radar. All 3 crew members sat in Martin Baker Mark I series ejection seats and accessed the aircraft through a hatch on the right side of the nose, a practical arrangement that would be refined in later variants but served this purpose well enough in the B2. The navigator and bomb aimer sat in the rear where they could at least enjoy each other's company and commiserate about the temperature control issues. And I can tell you from my vast experience of climbing into all of one Canberra that getting into the navigator's seat isn't the easiest, especially for Mr. Oldbones like me. The avionics fit in the aircraft was most certainly 1951 vintage, a mix of wartime systems updated for the jet age, but one thing I can say here is that the smell in there was glorious, simply glorious. It's only a matter of time before somebody bottles it. Don't judge. For those to whom such details are pure manna from heaven, the Canberra's electronic suite included a GH navigation system paired with a Rebecca beacon interrogation unit for distance measuring, VHF radio for communication, an IFF Mark 10 for identification, and the aptly named orange putter tail warning radar to alert you whenever someone was taking an unhealthy interest in your rear aspect. It was functional rather than sophisticated, but then again the B-2s carried no defensive armament, continuing Petter's philosophy that speed and altitude were better protection than gun turrets, getting high enough and fast enough that interception became, shall we say, difficult rather than impossible. Naturally, they also had those distinctive air brakes, hydraulically operated fingers on the wings that could deploy to create drag without upsetting stability, perfect for controlling descent rates or slowing down for landing without floating halfway down the runway. But for all its operational successes, the B-2 had a critical weakness. It could only train one pilot at a time, and that pilot had to learn in an operational aircraft just as Group Captain Sheen did on that spring morning in 1951, without the benefit of an instructor sitting beside him who could take control if the situation got a little out of hand. It was very clear to everyone that the RAF needed a dedicated training in Canberra. Unfortunately for some students, this new aircraft was to prove deadly. Enter, quite belatedly, the Canberra T Mark IV, developed to Air Ministry specification T2/49 and based on the B-2 airframe, but with one crucial modification: side-by-side seating for instructor and student pilot, both with full controls. The prototype flew on June 12, 1951 and the first production aircraft on September 20, 1953, with the type entering service with number 231 operational conversion unit in early 1954. The T4 shared more or less the B-2's dimensions and the same benign handling characteristics that made the Canberra such a pleasant aircraft to fly, but the external appearance was distinctly different, most obviously in the nose. Where the B-2 had that glazed perspex nose cone for the prone bomb aimer, the T4 had a solid nose section. The trainer kept the standard navigation and communication systems but carried no operational armament or bombing systems. The T4 was designed purely as a training aircraft meant to teach pilots how to fly the Canberra and navigators how to operate the systems. But there was a problem. The T4 was killing pilots, and nobody was entirely sure why. The crashes followed a disturbing pattern. The aircraft would take off normally, climb away from the airfield, and then, without warning, dive into the ground shortly after clearing the perimeter. Sometimes it happened at night, sometimes in poor visibility, but the result was always the same. Experienced instructors and promising students were dying in an aircraft that was supposed to be easy to fly, and the accident rate was climbing to alarming levels. Investigation teams examined wreckage, interviewed survivors when there were any, and pored over maintenance records looking for mechanical failures. What they eventually discovered wasn't a design flaw or a manufacturing defect, it was something far more insidious. A problem born from the Canberra's very success as a high-performance aircraft combined with the realities of pilot training in the early jet age. The root cause was the Canberra's exceptional acceleration. This was, remember, Britain's first jet bomber, and it could accelerate at rates that pilots simply weren't accustomed to. Most were coming from piston-engined aircraft like the Avro Lincoln, where acceleration was predictable and measurable by a calendar. In the Canberra, particularly the dual-control T4 trainer variant, the acceleration was dramatically faster and the difference was proving fatal. Here's what was happening. After takeoff, as the aircraft climbed away with its nose pitched up, the pilot would feel that surge of acceleration pushing him back into his seat. To a pilot trained on slower aircraft, that sensation combined with the visual cues from a nose-up attitude felt excessive, as if the aircraft was climbing too steeply and risking a stall. The instinctive response, particularly for a student pilot still building confidence, was to check the artificial horizon and correct what appeared to be an overly aggressive climb angle. But the artificial horizon, in the stress and confusion of those first moments after takeoff, could be misread. The combination of unfamiliar acceleration, the nose-up attitude, and perhaps a degree of spatial disorientation in poor visibility led pilots to believe they were climbing too steeply when in fact they were perfectly safe. The correction they applied, pushing the nose down to what they thought was a more reasonable attitude, was actually diving the aircraft towards the ground. By the time they realized their mistake, if they realized it at all, there wasn't enough altitude to recover. The problem was particularly acute during night flights or in conditions where visual references were limited, forcing pilots to rely heavily on their instruments. And it was exacerbated by the fact that jet conversion training had proven easier than anticipated, meaning some student pilots were undertaking night flights with relatively little daytime experience in type. They simply hadn't developed the instinctive feel for how a camera flew, and that lack of familiarity was costing lives. The solution, once the problem was understood, was straightforward, but required a fundamental change in training philosophy. The curriculum was revised to explicitly warn pilots about the possibility of misreading instruments during that critical phase after takeoff, emphasizing that the horizontal acceleration they'd feel in the camera was far greater than anything they'd experienced before. Instructors drilled students on maintaining the correct climb attitude regardless of what their instincts might be telling them, and emphasized cross-checking instruments rather than relying on any single reference. And for those of you whom have never experienced flying on instruments alone, it can be very disorientating when your senses are telling you one thing but the instruments are showing you something entirely different. I have stories, let me tell you, for another time, of course. The change in training procedures resulted in a dramatic reduction in the accident rate, though the lessons had been learnt at a terrible cost. Almost every Canberra operating squadron kept at least one T4 on strength for continuation training and pilot check flights, and the type proved so durable and reliable that it remained in operational service for decades. The T4's greatest contribution was bridging that gap between easy to fly and easy to fly first time without killing yourself. An instructor sitting beside you, able to demonstrate techniques and intervene immediately if things went wrong, made the transition from piston engine bombers to high altitude jet operations straightforward and safe. Together, the B2 and T4 formed the foundation of RAF Bomber Command's Cold War capability. The B2 carried the bombs, the T4 trained the crews. Simple as that. So now with the training sorted, the RAF decided to see just how far they could push her. The Canberra wasn't just a capable bomber, it was fast and it flew high, and throughout the 1950s it proceeded to set numerous world records for speed, distance and altitude, providing massive publicity for the British aircraft industry when it desperately needed some good news. These weren't marginal improvements over existing records. These were the kind of flights that made headlines, won trophies, and convinced air forces around the world that British aviation engineering was still world class. And it all started with a seagull. In early 1951, the RAF planned to show off the Canberra's capabilities with a special transatlantic flight from Northern Ireland to Newfoundland. Why was it special? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. The crew chosen for this feat were Squadron Leader Arthur Callard, along with navigators Lieutenant Haskett and Flight Lieutenant Robson, and they were scheduled to depart on February the 20th. Except about 3 minutes after takeoff from Wharton, while climbing through poor visibility, their Canberra B2, serial number Whiskey Delta 932, flew straight through a flock of seagulls. One bird struck the starboard wing inboard of the engine, punching an 8-inch hole clean through the leading edge. Not ideal for a record attempt. The aircraft diverted to RAF Aldergrove in Northern Ireland, where mechanics worked through the night removing feathers and patching the wing. The delay cost them a day and the weather forecast had deteriorated. But on February the 21st, Callard decided conditions were acceptable. At 12:43 local time, Whiskey Delta 932 departed Aldergrove and climbed to altitudes above 40,000 feet. Despite headwinds approaching 90 miles an hour, they were flying at over 7 miles a minute, covering the 2,100-mile Great Circle route to Gander, Newfoundland in 4 hours and 37 minutes. So, why was this flight so special? It was because this was the first jet aircraft to cross the Atlantic non-stop and unrefueled, and it beat the previous fastest crossing, a wartime Mosquito flying east by more than 2 hours. This feat impressed the USA enough that they would end up flying the Canberra. The thing was, the RAF hadn't requested official observers from the Royal Aero Club, so technically no official world record was set, but it was still the first unrefueled non-stop crossing of the Atlantic by a jet. Apparently, paperwork matters. But Roland Beeman, English Electric's chief test pilot and the man who'd first flown the Canberra prototype, wasn't about to let that stand. No sir. So, on August 31st, 1951, he took Canberra B2 Whiskey Delta 940 on the same route from Aldergrove to Gander, this time with proper FAI observers present. He completed the crossing in 4 hours, 18 minutes and 29 seconds, officially claiming the transatlantic speed record for Queen and Country and of course generating exactly the kind of publicity English Electric wanted. A year later, Beeman went further. On August 26, 1952, flying the prototype B5 variant, serial number Victor X-ray 185, this time fitted with the more powerful Avon Mark 109 engines and integral wing fuel tanks, he, together with his crew pilot Peter Hillwood and navigator Dennis Watson, departed Aldergrove. The flight to Gander took 4 hours, 18 minutes, where they refueled and got ready for the return leg. I'd like to think they probably had a cup of tea before hopping back in for the flight back to Aldergrove. That was flown by Peter Hillwood. Due to better conditions, the second crossing of the day took only 3 hours and 25 minutes. All told, the whole affair was wrapped up in 10 hours, 3 minutes and 29 seconds, averaging a speed of 412 miles an hour, making Beeman and his crew the first to complete a double Atlantic crossing by jet aircraft in a single day. Not a bad day out. Also, if you're ever in Scotland, you can see VX185 at the National Museum of Flight, or at the very least the nose section. The Canberra had proven it could cross oceans at speeds that made conventional piston engine bombers look positively leisurely. But speed over distance was only part of the story. The Canberra could also fly higher than anything else in the sky. In May 1953, Wing Commander Walter Wally Gibb, a test pilot for the Bristol Aeroplane Company, armed with a specially modified Canberra B2 fitted with experimental Bristol Olympus 99 turbojet engines, was going to see how high the Canberra could really go. The Olympus engines were used because they were more powerful than the standard Avons, but they had one unfortunate characteristic at extreme altitude. They tended to flame out when the air got too thin. However, why let a small detail like that put you off when you're trying to claim an altitude record? On the day, Gibb climbed until both engines flamed out at 63,000 feet. He then used his momentum to climb a little further, after which he glided down to land. The peak altitude his instruments has measured was 63,668 feet, breaking the previous altitude record of 59,446 feet set by John Cunningham in a Vampire F1. That's nearly 12 miles high, twice the height of Mount Everest, plus another 5,600 feet. Why am I such a nerd? But he wasn't done yet. 2 years later, in August 1955, Gibb broke his own record in the same aircraft, now designated Whiskey Delta 952 and fitted with more powerful Olympus 102s, which produced 12,000 pounds of thrust. Every pound of thrust was needed since the previous record had to be exceeded by a required 3%. And he just made it, reaching 65,889 feet over Bristol, around 311 feet beyond the 3% minimum rule. But they were not yet done. The best was still to come. The ultimate altitude record came in August 1957 when the Canberra flew to the edge of space. Okay, that's a bit of artistic license there, but we can say that the Canberra flew pretty damn high in this attempt. So, by then, pure turbojet power wasn't enough to push higher. What the Canberra needed was a rocket motor. So in came the Rocket Boys, D. Napier and Son, who fitted a double Scorpion liquid-fueled rocket engine into the bomb bay of Canberra B2 Whiskey Kilo 163. I can almost hear Clarkson screaming, "More power, yes!" On August 28, 1957, test pilots Michael Randrup and Walter Shirley, wearing pressure suits just in case, took off from Luton. They climbed to 44,000 feet using the standard Avon turbojets, and then they ignited the rocket. The Canberra shot upwards at a steep angle, climbing through altitudes where the air was so thin that aerodynamicists had calculated Randrup needed to keep the aircraft within a 15-knot speed range to avoid either stalling or exceeding critical Mach number. They called it Coffin Corner, the narrow margin between too slow and too fast at extreme altitude, where either mistake could be fatal. Randrup kept the Canberra within that impossibly tight envelope and reached 70,310 feet, more than 13 miles high, before the rocket exhausted its fuel and the aircraft began to descend. The record stood as the highest any aircraft had officially flown until the X-15 rocket plane began their flights in the early 60s. But if you ask which Canberra record mattered the most, it wasn't the Atlantic crossings or the altitude flights, it was a race. And I need to tell you why this one matters to me personally. There's an aircraft sitting in my local museum, has been there for as long as I can remember, and was among the very first aircraft positioned for display ahead of the museum's grand opening in 1972. So, lots of school trips as a nipper, plenty of those since my school was across the road, lucky me, plus Dad taking me on weekends, and now, decades later, as an old codger, I still visit her. This is English Electric Canberra PR3 serial number Whiskey Echo 139, and she's been part of my earliest memories sitting there next to the Hunter and Lightning, and if anyone is around I will never hesitate to stop and tell them the story of an amazing flight that for me captures the spirit of Britain that is now seemingly long gone. This is her story. In 1953, the city of Christchurch in New Zealand decided to mark its centenary with an air race from London to Christchurch, approximately 12,270 miles by the route flown. They called it the last great air race, and they weren't exaggerating. The race was divided into two sections, a speed section for military aircraft and a section for commercial transports. The prize money was £10,000 for the speed section winner, quite a substantial amount in 1953, and they get to take home the Harewood Gold Cup. The RAF entered 3 Canberras from number 540 Squadron, 2 PR3's photo reconnaissance variants and 1 PR7. All 3 were modified with extra fuel tanks in the bomb bays, uprated engines tweaked for additional thrust, and larger brakes to handle the extra weight. The Royal Australian Air Force sent 2 Australian-built Canberra B-20s from No. 1 long-range flight, commanded by Wing Commander Derek Cumming, the first man to fly a jet aircraft in Australia, with Squadron Leader Peter Raw flying the 2nd Australia Canberra. 5 Canberras racing halfway around the world. The race began on October 9, 1953. The route was punishing. London to Sheba in Iraq, then Ceylon, Cocos Islands and Perth before the final leg across Australia to Christchurch. 4 stops, each requiring rapid refueling while the clock kept running. Flight Lieutenant Roland Monty Burton, with Navigator Flight Lieutenant Don Gannon beside him, flew RAF Canberra PR3 Whiskey Echo 139, race number 3. The Royal Australian Air Force's squadron leader Raw got off to a commanding start, but an 86-minute delay at Woomera for refueling cost him the lead. Burton overtook him and pressed on. On the morning of October the 10th, Whiskey Echo 139 touched down at Christchurch Harewood Airport during a heavy storm at 5:37 local time, 40 minutes ahead of the second place aircraft. Total elapsed time, 23 hours, 50 minutes, 42 seconds. Flying time, 22 hours, 29 minutes. Average speed, 515 miles an hour over the route distance of 12,270 miles. Burton and Gannon had just become the first men to fly from London to New Zealand in under 24 hours. The second place finisher, Squadron Leader Raw in the Australian Canberra, who'd flown brilliantly despite the Woomera delay, finishing with an elapsed time of 24 hours and 32 minutes. And third place went to another RAF Canberra flown by Flight Lieutenant Furs in Whiskey Echo 142. The other two Canberras didn't finish the race on time. The second Australian aircraft suffered a burst tyre at Cocos Island and had to wait 55 hours for repairs, during which time the crew drank beer and went for a swim. Oh, such hardships. The fifth Canberra, an RAF PR-7, also encountered technical difficulties. But the three that finished all completed the flight within 90 minutes of flying time of each other, which tells you everything about the Canberra's consistency and reliability over extreme distances. Burton and Gannon were awarded the Britannia Trophy. The £10,000 prize went to the RAF Benevolent Fund. Squadron Leader Raw's £3,000 second place prize was donated to the Royal Australian Air Force's Welfare Trust Fund. And Whiskey Echo 139, the winning aircraft, race number 3, eventually made its way to a museum where one day little Jo and countless other kids were inspired by her story. I'm not crying, you're crying. To this day, that record has never been broken. No aircraft has flown from London to Christchurch faster than Burton and Gannon did in October 1953, and given that commercial aviation has long since made such races obsolete, it's entirely possible no aircraft ever will. The race demonstrated something strategically important too. It proved that jet aircraft could be rapidly dispersed around the world in an emergency, which mattered considerably more to military planners than it did to the press covering the event. The Canberra set other records throughout the 1950s, London to Cape Town and back, Ottawa to London, New York to London, but the Christchurch race captured the public imagination a way that technical demonstrations never could. There was something romantic about a race halfway around the world, something that reminded people of the great air races of the 1930s when aviators competed for glory and governments competed for prestige. By the time the record-breaking flights ended in 1958, the Canberra had established Britain as a serious competitor in the jet age. These weren't just publicity stunts. Every record proved the aircraft's capabilities to potential customers. And these demonstrated British engineering excellence to a world market and reminded everyone that the nation that had built the Spitfire and the Mosquito could still build world-class aircraft. Burton and Gannon's 23-hour dash to Christchurch, Gibbs's climb to the edge of space, Beaumont's double Atlantic crossing, these turned out to be the best sales pitch English Electric could have asked for. The Canberra was not just filling the record books, she was also, more importantly, filling the order books. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. On July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Nasser walked up to a microphone in Alexandria and announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. It didn't come out of nowhere. The Suez Canal had been Britain's imperial lifeline since 1869, the quickest route to India, the Far East, and most importantly by 1956, Middle Eastern oil. The canal was controlled by the Suez Canal Company, in which Britain held the largest stake. Roughly 2/3 of Europe's oil passed through it, and Britain still behaved like the de facto landlord, even though its military withdrawal from the canal zone had only been completed a few months earlier. Nasser had other ideas. He'd been positioning Egypt as a leader of Arab nationalism and non-alignment in the Cold War. Tensions with Israel were escalating, Palestinian Fedayeen guerrillas were launching raids into Israel from Gaza, and Egypt was backing them. After a particularly bloody Israeli retaliatory raid on Gaza in February 1955, Nasser approached the United States for weapons. The Americans refused. They feared Nasser would use them against Israel and wanted to maintain an arms balance in the region, so Egypt approached Britain, but they also refused. Nasser then turned to Czechoslovakia, a Soviet satellite state, and secured a substantial arms deal in 1955. And now the alarm bells were going off in London and Washington. This looked uncomfortably like Egypt tilting towards the Soviet bloc. In response, the United States and Britain withdrew their promised funding for the Aswan High Dam, a massive project that NASA saw as key to Egypt's future. It was a deliberate snub designed to bring NASA to heel. Instead, he hit back where it would hurt most. The canal was generating millions of dollars in annual revenue. NASA announced that he'd use those funds to build the dam himself, and in one move, he'd asserted Egyptian sovereignty, humiliated former colonial powers, and became a hero across the Arab world. The British and French governments were not amused, and by October they'd hatched a plan, a rather convoluted one as it happens. At a secret meeting in Sèvres, France, Britain and France and Israel agreed to coordinate their actions. Israel had its own grievances, the Fedayeen raids, the Straits of Tiran blockade, and NASA's new Soviet arsenal. Israel would attack Egypt first, ostensibly in retaliation for the Fedayeen attacks. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both sides demanding they withdraw from the canal. When Egypt refused, which was guaranteed, Britain and France would intervene to separate their combatants and secure the canal. It was diplomatic theatre, but it gave everyone plausible deniability, or so they thought. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was personally obsessed with bringing NASA down. He'd convinced himself that NASA was another Hitler who needed to be stopped before he became unstoppable. At the time, Eden's health was failing. He was on heavy medication to keep functioning, and along with his health failing, so was his judgment. The decision to invade would end his political career, though he didn't know that yet. And so the wheels of the military machine began to turn. Within months, 97 Canberras were staging through Malta and Cyprus, preparing for what would become Operation Musketeer, which sounds rather more genteel than the reality of what was about to happen. The RAF's contribution to the operation was substantial. Along with new Vickers Valiant V-bombers, the Canberras would form the Strategic Bombing Force, tasked with destroying the Egyptian Air Force on the ground before it could threaten the invasion fleet. The plan was straightforward enough on paper: neutralize Egyptian airfields, seize the canal, and presumably everything would sort itself out from there. Well, naturally, of course, they thought that. So on September the 22nd, 29 Canberra B-6s arrived at Halfar, Malta, the longer-legged variant chosen specifically for the extra range from the more distant island base. I'll put the Malta squadrons up on a screen. Cyprus got the shorter range B2s with 7 squadrons squeezed onto Nicosia under Group Captain C.G.O. Key. That's a lot of aircraft on one airfield. Again, I'll put the Cyprus squadrons up on a screen. But the key unit was 139 Squadron with their specialised B6s fitted with the Blue Shadow radar for target marking. They joined the Photo Reconnaissance PR-7s that were already based at Akrotiri, although additional crews flew in from the UK to provide backup. The sheer number of aircraft crammed onto these Mediterranean bases created conditions that would have made peacetime planners weep, but this wasn't peacetime anymore. Starting in early August, just after NASA's announcement, under Exercise Accumulate, bombs and other munitions were beginning to be ferried south to the Mediterranean bases. Between August the 2nd and 11th, 44 Squadron alone made 29 trips, each aircraft carrying 6 1,000-pound bombs with, of course, the safety pins in. In the rear hatches, they also carried large nets full of cabbages, fresh vegetables being a treat for personnel at the forward bases, which sounds rather more domestic than one might expect for a combat operation, but there you are. The crews had been trained to use the ground station-based GH bombing system for precision targeting. Excellent technology, except for one detail: there was no GH coverage over Egypt. None. Which was exactly why 139 Squadron had been cleared for target marking operations months before Suez had kicked off. Without GH, the Canberra crews would be using World War II style target marking procedures, the sort of thing their fathers might have done over Germany in Lancasters just a little over a decade earlier. These specialised B6s would find the targets and obviously mark them, in theory. Like the other British and French aircraft involved, all the Canberras soon sported broad yellow and black identification stripes around the fuselage and wings. Invasion stripes really, though they'd run short of yellow paint, so some used white instead. What has always been puzzling to me was why they bothered, given that the Valiants and the transport aircraft weren't painted and the number of aircraft operating at any one time was actually quite small, but procedures are procedures apparently. On October the 29th, Israel attacked as planned. Britain and France issued their ultimatum on October the 30th to both Egypt and Israel, demanding they cease fighting and withdraw 10 miles from the canal. Egypt, unsurprisingly, refused, which was rather the point. As the deadline approached the following afternoon, RAF Further Reconnaissance Canberras updated the target information. Large numbers of Egyptian jets were spotted at 8 major air bases. I'll put the target list on screen, most of which ironically had been RAF stations until quite recently. The bombing campaign kicked off on the evening of October the 31st, 1956. At 17:15 hours, 4 Canberra B-6s of 139 Squadron lifted off from Nicosia to Cairo West. But at the last moment, and I mean at the very last moment, the objective was changed to Al Mazrah. 6 B-2s and a solitary B-6 from 139 Squadron followed. The first flares, the target indicators went down from Flight Lieutenant John Slater, the master bomber of the night. Slater later recalled flying high over the target, watching the airfield beautifully illuminated below, then seeing his bombs walk across the runway, the lights flickering with fires taking hold, and from his vantage point everything looked exactly as the plan intended. But there was one slight hiccup. It may not have been the airfield they were supposed to be bombing. Thanks to extremely rushed planning and a last-minute change of target from Cairo West to Al Mazrah, the coordinates were, let's say, not as solid as one would ideally like when dropping high explosives near a capital city. Some post-raid reports suggest that instead of Al Mazrah, at least part of the attack may have landed on Cairo West, an entirely different airfield on the opposite side of the city. Other accounts muddy the water further by referring it to as Cairo International, which doesn't help anyone's sanity. Either way, the consensus is this: the Canberras definitely hit an airfield, just not necessarily the intended one. Lack of normal time for flight planning was later cited as the cause of this rather significant navigational error, which is diplomatic language for everything happened so quickly that someone got the coordinates mixed up. Not exactly an auspicious beginning Bomber Command might have hoped for. The crews flying that night had a distinctly memorable experience. Fred Jones of 44 Squadron later described settling into the cockpit of his B-2, feeling the familiar huff-puff of the oxygen check and climbing to 25,000 feet in the darkness. As they progressed southward, he could see the faint glow far to the left, air raids already in progress. Then his navigator called for the turn to heading 140 for their bombing run, and suddenly the glow lined up directly under their nose. Simultaneously, the familiar voice of John Slater came over the radio loud and clear, "Tally-ho!" as he dived down to mark the target. Fred's bomb aimer, Dick Angier, now in the prone position looking through the bombing window, called out the familiar litany.
"Left, left, steady, 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 bomb's gone."
Then after a pause,
"We've got a hang-up."
Fred shook the aircraft around as violently as he could, pushing and pulling the control column, rolling from side to side.
"It's gone!"
Dick yelled.
"Close the doors!"
They turned steeply to the right and climbed, heading north for home. Just like an exercise really, except for live bombs and the war. The second raid that night struck at Al Mazrah, the actual Al Mazrah this time, with 7 aircraft each from Malta and Cyprus, with 4 B-6s of 139 Squadron again providing the target marking. The third target was Kabrit, where many MiGs were known to be parked. Nicosia and Halfar again dispatched 7 Canberras each. Over 130 bombs were released. A journalist witnessing the departures from Nicosia wrote of Canberras roaring down the runway one after another, their twin engines emitting an ear-piercing whistle, climbing high into the night sky and setting course for the Egyptian coast, only about half an hour's flying time away. At around midnight, it was Abu Suez's turn, with aircraft from both Malta and Nicosia combining for the strike. These included aircraft from 61 Squadron making their first contribution to the campaign, and the final raid of the night was to Ichas, marked by a World War II veteran from 139 Squadron. One of the aircraft, piloted by 24-year-old flying officer Desmond Raymond, Kenyan, blocked Nicosia's taxiway after its undercarriage collapsed. Here's what happened. In a chilly November night, Kenyan's Canberra was sitting on the runway, fully loaded with bombs, engines running, when his aircraft slumped nose down onto the concrete. Within the hour, he was standing in front of squadron leader Norman Hartley. "What's the matter, Dennis?" Hartley demanded. "Did you push the wrong button?" Kenyan, in frustration, told Hartley that he deliberately retracted his wheels because "I did not altogether approve what we're doing in Egypt." At the court-martial in Nicosia, Kenyan changed his story. He insisted he'd pushed the wrong button by mistake. He was upset and nervous. The cockpit was dark and he felt hurried because the briefing had run behind schedule. The flap and undercarriage buttons were close together. He explained, "I have no political or religious views. I gave that reason merely because I was dreadfully worried over my tragic mistake. It was far better, I thought, to say I had intentionally caused the Canberra damage rather than to say that I had made a mistake and was incompetent." The prosecutor wasn't buying it, pointing out that Kenyan, by his own admission, had been unable to sleep or eat for days. He charged that Kenyan had wrecked his plane out of simple fear. After deliberating for an hour, the court-martial found Kenyan guilty of acting willfully to avoid carrying out a warlike operation in the air when under orders. Sentence: dismissal from service and 1 year in jail. The irony is that Dennis Kenyan later became a world-class helicopter pilot, freestyle aerobatic champion, and stunt pilot for Black Hawk Down. He flew until his death in 2020, having rebuilt a career from that November night in Cyprus when everything fell apart on that darkened runway. In my opinion, for what it's worth, it takes a man of strong character to rebuild as he did. While Kenyan's court-martial played out quietly in Cyprus, the bombing campaign continued at full pace. Post-attack reconnaissance showed the results that first night to have been disappointing. Most runways had been cratered, certainly, but the runways were still operational. 14 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground, but the Egyptian Air Force was very much still in business. Here's what became clear quite quickly. Low-level strikes by smaller fighters were far more effective than high-altitude night bombing. The fighters could see what they were shooting at, get down low where bombs actually hit where you were aiming at, and make multiple passes if needed. Not exactly the vindication of strategic bombing theory that Bomber Command might have hoped for, but the Canberras adapted. Daylight strikes were ordered. After a day of heavy strikes by ground attack fighters on November the 1st, the bombers prepared for raids on Cairo West, Luxor, Fayid and Kasfarit. Once more, it was Nicosia's 139 Squadron that marked for 7 Canberras from Malta and another 7 from Cyprus. One pilot recalled there was a tremendous concentration of bombs on Cairo West. An hour later, Wing Commander Helmore led 8 27 Squadron Canberras, along with half a dozen from 10, 5 from 15 and 1 from 61, headed for Luxor. This was an important target. Allied intelligence had located the Egyptian Air Force's Ilyushin 28 Beagle twin-jet bombers there, tucked away at Egypt's southernmost airfield where they presumably thought they'd be safe. The 4 markers from 139 Squadron also carried bombs on this occasion. One of the target markers, flown by squadron leader Peter Mallory, had to improvise when his gyroscopes toppled. Not an uncommon problem at high altitude, but undaunted, he simply dive-bombed the Part Beagles instead. For the attack on Fayed, 18 Squadron provided the markers for 6 bombers from Nicosia and 5 from Halfar. One of the latter suffered an engine failure on the return flight but landed safely, which must have concentrated the minds of everyone on board. As dawn broke on November 2nd, Allied intelligence assessed that the combined airstrikes had destroyed over 100 Egyptian aircraft and caused significant damage to many air bases. With the lack of any credible air opposition, it was decided to make a precision low-level high-speed attack against a Cairo radio station in the Abu Zabal suburb. 18 Nicosia-based Canberras, escorted by a dozen French F-84F Thunderstreaks, went in at 1500 feet doing 300 plus knots, then popped up to 3000 feet to drop bombs. One of the pilots later recalled that the sighting angle was in excess of 70 degrees and his navigator, over 16 stone and suitably rotund, had difficulty getting down low enough to sight properly. Flying at relatively high speed and low level over the Cairo suburbs made visual map reading extremely difficult. They missed the target the first time and, against briefing, turned around for another go, which takes a certain amount of nerve when people are shooting at you. The round-the-clock offensive continued. Another raid to Luxor, flown exclusively by Cyprus-based aircraft, saw one bomber sustain flak damage to the tail, the first confirmed hit on a Canberra during the campaign. Attacks then switched to the huge Egyptian transport depot at Huckstep Camp, east of Cairo. The pilots reported better accuracy due to the perfect placing of the target markers, which sort of suggests that 139 Squadron had finally sorted out their navigation issues from that first night. Al Greethurst, a navigator with 109 Squadron operating from Malta, flew multiple missions during the campaign. His squadron had originally been designated as Pathfinders, but at the last moment they were demoted to Main Force Operations, bombing from 40,000 feet from what Al described as Heath Robinson bomb aiming equipment. The squadron was not pleased about this perceived demotion, though the reasoning was sound enough. Marking runs in a shallow dive consumed too much fuel for the Malta-based aircraft to make the round trip safely. On their first mission to Al Mazar, Al and his crew discovered the jet stream was such that it took them 2 hours to reach the target, but nearly 4 hours to get back. On this first mission, their wingtip fuel tanks failed to feed properly. Now running precariously low on fuel on reaching Malta, they called Lucca for an immediate landing. Their request was refused. Air traffic control told them to fly the trombone pattern, a time-consuming meandering circuit, for another 30 minutes. Al's pilot swore profusely and said, "I'm coming in." A more superior voice came on the radio. "It's alright, Lucca, we'll take over from here." It was the Royal Navy's radar station at Halfar. They talked the Canberra down, and as they landed, one of the engines began to wind down, out of fuel. They'd come that close to ditching in the Mediterranean. Further daylight raids were ordered for November the 3rd to degrade Egyptian army capabilities before the planned landings. The barracks at Al Mazar were hit repeatedly throughout the morning by waves of Canberras. Before noon, another 22 aircraft carried out shallow dive bombing attacks on the rail yards at Nefisha in a raid described as particularly successful. Strikes in preparation for the landings continued on the night of November the 4th. The target, the fortress stronghold at El Gami, 12 miles west of Alexandria. 4 crews from 109 Squadron were selected, but the target was not properly marked due to flak and only 2 crews successfully bombed it. The other 2 had to jettison their 1,000-pound bombs out at sea. But the flak always seemed to explode below the Canberras, possibly incorrect fusing heights on the Egyptian guns, though we'll never know for certain. Small blessings regardless. The parachute landings near Port Said began at 700 hours on November the 5th, with the drop zone being marked by 139 Squadron Canberras. Half an hour before this, 16 Canberras from Nicosia hit Egyptian forward bases to ensure that no reinforcements could be moved up. This was repeated 2 hours later by a second wave of 21 aircraft. These proved to be the final Canberra raids of the Suez campaign. To back up ground operations by airborne forces, amphibious landings began at Port Said the following morning under a massive land and sea-based air umbrella. In the face of mounting international pressure, particularly from the United States, a ceasefire was being called for. A ceasefire that came a little too late for some. Not every reconnaissance mission over the Middle East went according to plan. In the tense autumn of 1956, as the Suez crisis escalated, RAF Canberra PR-7s were flying regular photo reconnaissance sorties along the Syrian coast and into the interior. The missions followed predictable routes. Latakia on the coast, then inland over Aleppo and Homs, heading towards Damascus before turning west over Beirut and back to Cyprus. Intelligence suggested significant build-ups of Soviet-supplied combat aircraft, the kind of information the British needed. The Syrians had noticed the pattern, but the Syrians had a problem. They had fighters, Gloucester Meteor NF-13s, ironically supplied by the United Kingdom just 18 months earlier, but they had no radar, no ground control intercept system, no way to track high-altitude intruders or coordinate interceptions. What they did have was telephones. Squadron leader Tahir Zaki of the Egyptian Air Force, serving as air attaché in Damascus, devised an ingenious low-tech solution. Police lookouts were posted around Syria's frontiers and along the coast. If they spotted an unfamiliar aircraft, they telephoned their local police headquarters. Those calls were then routed to Major Mukabri, a Syrian Air Force ground controller who coordinated the bearings and extrapolated the intruder's track and approximate speed. It was slow, often too slow. By the time fighters scrambled, the Canberra would be long gone. But if you knew the route in advance... Tahir Zaki recalled the system. The Syrians had no radar, so I gave the SAF commander a plan to shoot down these Canberras, using just telephones for communication. Above all, we needed a direct telephone link between Latakia and the main airfield at Damascus. The Canberras kept coming, always the same route, and the Syrians waited. On the morning of November 6, 1956, a Canberra PR-7 took off from Cyprus on a reconnaissance sortie over Syria, and around 800 hours, Syrian Meteor pilot Lieutenant Hafez al-Assad intercepted the aircraft and opened fire. The Canberra escaped, heading back to Cyprus. The crew reported being chased by meteors in unidentified markings. Although they'd found their targets, they were covered with clouds and returned without the required photographs. Air headquarters in Cyprus was not happy. They insisted that a second Canberra be sent immediately to get the photographs of Syrian airfields and the oil pipeline. Flight Lieutenant Bernie Hunter decided to fly the mission himself. Just slightly after noon on the 6th, Canberra PR-7 Whiskey Hotel 799 lifted off from RAF Akaturi in Cyprus with 3 crew members aboard. Flight Lieutenant Bernie Hunter piloting, Flying Officer Roy Urquhart pulling, navigating, and Flight Lieutenant Sam Small, another pilot who had been sent out to reinforce the squadron during the crisis, came along to watch the aircraft's tail. After the Egyptian MiG-15 interceptors on October the 30th, when 2 Canberras had been fired upon over the canal zone, headquarters ordered a local modification. A periscope was mounted aft based on an earlier astronavigation sextant design. It allowed the lookout to spot the contrails of attacking fighters. Small's job was simple: watch the sky behind them and warn Hunter if anything came close. The mission itself was straightforward: photograph Riyak airfield in Lebanon, Nairab near Aleppo, and Al-Rashid near Baghdad. Hunter kept the Canberra under cloud cover initially, descended to 12,000 feet, then 10,000 feet to get proper overlapping photographs. Navigation was excellent, the weather was cooperating, everything seemed routine. In Syria, 6 Meteor pilots had been sitting in a cockpit since 1000 hours. Waiting. 2 at Nairab near Aleppo, 4 at El Meze near Damascus. They'd been waiting for over 2 hours when the call came through. The telephone network lit up. Latakia reported a Canberra entering Syrian airspace over the coast. The Syrians scrambled their fighters. Tahir Zaki, coordinating with Major Makubri, recalled the plan. Since the Canberra was over Latakia, we telephoned Damascus and told the pilots to start their engines and take off. The Canberra was by then over Aleppo. There was usually low cloud over Damascus at the time in the morning, so we told the pilots to stay hidden in the clouds. When they got the message that the Canberra had passed over Homs, they were to climb out and prepare to attack. The meteors took off, climbed to altitude and disappeared into clouds over Damascus, waiting. Hunter had no idea they were there. Then, as he later recalled, we were heading towards Damascus when, to our horror, blue sky. Normally a pilot's dream, but under operating conditions we were, to say the least, in a very unenviable position. The cloud cover had broken up. Suddenly, Whiskey Hotel 799 was exposed, a dark silhouette against a clear sky, exactly where the Syrians expected it to be, at exactly the altitude they'd calculated. Hunter's first reaction was immediate. My first reaction was to climb on full power to get back into cloud cover, as it would have been absolutely fatal if we tried to go over Damascus airfield at that heightened speed. He pushed the throttles forward, the Canberra began climbing hard. In the few clouds above Damascus, the Syrian meteors were waiting. Ground control radioed, "The target is below you, look down." The meteor pilots looked down, they saw the Canberra. They rolled in for a stern attack. Hunter saw them coming. Sam Small, watching from the astronavigation periscope, called out the meteors approaching, a pair of them, closing fast. Hunter's first instinct was to climb, get into whatever cloud cover there was above, use the concealment to break contact. But Small was calling out fighters. Port side, no. Starboard, another vector. It didn't matter. Defensive doctrine was simple. Turn into the attack, make yourself a harder target, spoil their firing run. So Hunter turned. The first pass missed. Good. The Canberra was still climbing, still maneuvering, still trying to claw its way towards the cloud. Then Small's voice again. Another pair of meteors inbound. Totally different direction entirely. Hunter had to turn again, and hard. Each turn stole airspeed, each maneuver flattened the climb. The cloud layer, the one thing that might save them, hovered just out of reach. The meteors kept arriving from new angles, forcing Hunter to defend, to dodge, to survive, but never giving him the uninterrupted climb he needed. That's when the starboard engine was hit. Hunter had been calling Roy on the intercom, trying to get him to come back from the prone navigator's position in the nose to the rumble seat, a spare seat alongside the pilot where he'd have a better chance if they had to abandon the aircraft. Roy got the message. Well, Hunter thinks he got the message, but Roy didn't come back. The Canberra was still under attack, the starboard engine was burning, control was deteriorating fast. Hunter told Sam Small to eject. Small punched out from the rear navigator's position and got away safely. Hunter kept trying to reach Roy on the radio. Nothing. No response. By this point, the situation was critical. The aircraft was going down, one engine out, the other struggling, Syrian fighters still pressing the attack. Hunter assumes, although he'll never know for certain, that Roy went back to the rear navigation position to try and eject using a seat there. But Sam Small had already used it. The seat was gone. Roy would have tried to bail out manually through the hatch. Then Hunter heard it, a big thud against the aircraft. He thinks it was Roy's body hitting the tailplane. Hunter had seconds to make a decision. The Canberra was too low, losing altitude fast. If he didn't get out immediately, he wasn't getting out at all. He pulled the ejection handle, the seat fired, the parachute deployed, and then almost immediately he hit the ground. He'd ejected so low that he'd barely had the time to register what was happening before he hit, breaking his left ankle on impact. He didn't know where he was. Lebanon? Syria? Whether he'd make it through the next minutes depended entirely on which side of the border he'd landed. As it turned out, Hunter and Small had ejected virtually on the frontier. They'd landed just inside Lebanese territory. Hunter's Canberra and Roy's body came down just inside Syria. A crowd gathered around Hunter almost immediately. They assumed he was an Israeli pilot and started roughing him up. Things were getting dangerous. Then an English-speaking local teacher intervened, told the crowd to leave him alone and asked Hunter who he was. Hunter explained he was RAF, British. The situation calmed down somewhat. Later, Hunter would reflect on one detail that probably saved his life that day. Unlike many RAF aircrew, he didn't carry a pistol. If he'd been armed, the crowd may have assumed he was a threat. The situation might have escalated differently. Instead, the teacher handed him over to the Lebanese border post, where he was interrogated by a Syrian officer before eventually being transferred to Beirut Military Hospital. Both Hunter and Small were later repatriated to the UK. Flying Officer Roy Urquhart Pullin, his body was recovered and he was buried with full military honours. The shootdown wasn't luck, it wasn't a fortuitous intercept, it was careful planning by Syrian and Egyptian officers who'd studied the RAF's patterns, devised a low-tech solution to track high-altitude intruders, and position their fighters exactly where they knew the camera would be. The irony that British-supplied Meteors, flown by Syrian pilots trained by British instructors, shot down a British reconnaissance aircraft wasn't lost on anyone. Squadron leader Al-Assasa and Lieutenant Al-Garoudi, the two Syrian pilots credited with the kill, would both go on to distinguished careers. Al-Assasa later trained on MiG-17s in Poland and rose to command all Syrian Air Force fighter squadrons. Al-Garoudi eventually commanded a mixed Syrian-Egyptian MiG-17 night fighter unit. And Lieutenant Hafez Al-Assad, well, the pilot who chased the earlier Canberra that morning and failed to bring it down, he'd go on to become president of Syria, though that's probably a story for another time. The loss of Whiskey Hotel 799 and its navigator highlighted the risks these crews faced. Missions flown in hostile airspace, often alone, always vulnerable, gathering intelligence that could trigger international incidents. The Canberra was fast, it could fly high, it had proven itself as a reconnaissance platform, but it wasn't invulnerable, and the Syrians had proven that you didn't need sophisticated radar systems or advanced technology to bring one down. Sometimes a telephone network and patience were enough. One additional aircraft, a B-6 Whiskey Tango 371 of 139 Squadron, crashed at Nicosia on November the 6th while being ferried back to the UK for battle damage repairs. As the aircraft took off, it suffered an engine fire in the starboard Avon. The pilot applied full power on the one remaining good engine. The aircraft flipped over and crashed short of the runway. All three crew members were lost. Flying Officer Leslie Ian Collins, Flying Officer Kenneth Walter Banyard, and Flight Sergeant Morris Allen Rhodes. Ginger Rhodes had achieved a certain fame earlier in his career during a night bombing exercise out of Binbrook. He'd scored 3 out of 4 direct hits on targets at the live range. On his 5th run, apparently he mistook the lights in the car park at the Prussian Queen pub for the target and dropped his flash bomb on the ladies' toilets. By way of punishment, he spent the following week at Binbrook with a toilet seat around his neck, which is the sort of thing that happens in the RAF apparently. Rest in peace, lads. By the grim arithmetic of air war, that's a remarkably light casualty rate for a campaign involving 278 sorties and nearly 1,500 bombs dropped. But there's one thing about Operation Musketeer. It worked militarily and failed politically. The Anglo-French invasion force had landed troops at Port Said on November the 6th. By then, President Eisenhower had made it abundantly clear that the United States was not going to support this particular adventure. The CIA's U-2 spy planes had photographed the entire build-up, which greatly irritated Eisenhower when he realized his allies were planning an invasion they'd carefully not mentioned to him. The timing couldn't have been worse. On November the 4th, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to crush the Hungarian uprising. Britain and France were denouncing Soviet aggression in Hungary while simultaneously invading Egypt. The hypocrisy was rather difficult to miss. It gave Khrushchev cover to threaten volunteer forces and even hint at rocket attacks on London and Paris if the invasion didn't stop. Eisenhower didn't mess about. The United States threatened to dump British government bonds and block emergency IMF loans, which would have crashed the British pound. Eden had gone to war without telling his closest ally, and now that ally was prepared to destroy the British economy to make him stop, and hence why the ceasefire came on November the 7th. Eden would resign 3 months later, his health broken and his political legacy in ruins. In Parliament, he'd repeatedly denied any collusion with Israel, even though the Sevres Protocol had been signed weeks earlier. The lies caught up with him eventually, as lies tend to do. The Canberra had proven herself in combat. The problem was that they'd been sent to solve a political crisis with bombs, and bombs have never been particularly good at solving political crises, no matter how precisely you drop them or how many zeros you add to the sortie count. The Suez crisis became a turning point for British foreign policy, marking the end of a certain kind of imperial overreach and the beginning of a rather more modest approach to international affairs. It was in many ways the last time the RAF tried to fight a modern war using the methods and the mindsets of the last one. For the Canberra, it was just another deployment, and the English lady would be called upon to fight in many more wars. While the B-2 and T-4 established the Canberra as a capable bomber and training platform, the aircraft's real versatility lay in its ability to be adapted for specialised roles that nobody had fully anticipated when Teddy Petter first sketched out the design. The modular construction philosophy that had seemed so practical on paper proved transformative in practice, allowing the Canberra to evolve into variants that would push the boundaries of what was technically possible and politically acceptable during the Cold War's most dangerous years. In fact, at last count, there were 40 variants of the Canberra over her service life. Far too many to cover in a single video, but we'll cover the first of these specialized variants that emerged almost immediately. The PR-3, or Photo Reconnaissance Mark III, was developed to Air Ministry specification PR31/46 as a jet-powered successor to the venerable de Havilland Mosquito, which had performed strategic reconnaissance during the latter part of World War 35 aircraft that lacked both the range and altitude needed for Cold War intelligence gathering. The PR-3 prototype VX-181 first flew on March 19, 1950, and the design was straightforward enough. Take the B-2 airframe, stretch the front fuselage by 14 inches to create a dedicated camera bay forward of the wing, modify the bomb aimer's nose position, and convert the bomb bay space into an additional fuel tank. The result was an aircraft that looked similar to the B-2 but with a slightly different nose profile. With the same Mark I Avon engines, the PR-3 had performance broadly similar to the B-2, but a dramatically improved range of 3,555 miles, over 900 miles more than a standard bomber. And since there were no bombs, the crew was reduced to 2, pilot and navigator, both equipped with ejection seats. The interior was, believe it or not, less cramped than the B-2's coal hole arrangement, though getting into the navigator's seat still wasn't easy. It really wasn't. The camera fit was comprehensive. In the day roll, the PR-3 typically carried 6 standard f/52 cameras and 1 f/49 survey camera in that stretched fuselage bay. For night operations, it carried 2 f/89 cameras, photocells, and a photo flash crate that could illuminate targets from altitude. That's what you see here. The f/52 camera, with its 36-inch focal length, was more than adequate for medium altitude work, but deemed insufficient for high altitude interpretation above 45,000 feet, which would drive development of later variants with more sophisticated optics. The PR-3 entered service of No. 540 Squadron in December 1952, replacing them with the type. But the PR-3's service life was brief, and only 35 were built, and was rapidly superseded by the improved PR-7. This aircraft, which flew on August 16, 1953, was fitted with the uprated Avon Mark 109 engines that produced 7,500 pounds of thrust each, and crucially, this model had integral wing fuel tanks that added 900 gallons of capacity. This wet-wing modification, along with the fuselage tanks, gave the PR-7 a total capacity of 3,305 gallons and extended the range by a further 750 miles over the PR-3. And for those of you that can't be bothered to pull out a calculator, the PR-7 had a range of approximately 4,200 miles. 74 of these PR-7s were built by English Electric, and specialized versions designated the PR-57 that were tropicalized were sold to India. The PR-7 retained the PR-3 stretched fuselage and similar camera configurations and is served with the RAF's primary photographic reconnaissance units, often based overseas, and No. 542 Squadron was the first to receive the PR-7 in May 1954, followed quickly by No. 540 Squadron. But taking reconnaissance photographs from safe airspace is one thing, flying over the Soviet Union itself is quite another. And that leads us to one of the most enduring mysteries in Canberra history, the alleged overflight of Kapustin Yar, the Soviet Union's Area 51. For decades, it's been claimed that in August 1953, a specially modified Canberra flew deep into Soviet airspace to photograph the Kapustin Yar missile test range, one of the boldest intelligence missions of the Cold War. The story involves advanced American camera technology, a near-miss interception by Soviet MiG-15s, betrayal by Kim Philby, who was a senior British intelligence agent working for the Russians, and evidence that's, well, complicated. I'd originally planned an entire chapter on this. In fact, I had written quite a substantial amount on this topic. But the more I researched it, the deeper I dug, the more I realized the Kapustin Yar, it needs its own dedicated video. The technical details are simply fascinating, but the sources contradict each other, and the truth is probably more interesting than the legend. So that's coming, but I will say this, whether or not a Canberra overflew Kapustin Yar, another operation, Project Robin, did exist, and it proved remarkably effective at gathering intelligence without, obviously, starting World War III. Now, Project Robin was approved in June 1953 and involved a specially modified Canberra B-2 serial Whiskey Hotel 726, and it was fitted with an American 240-inch low-ROP or long-range oblique photography camera system. This wasn't just any camera, it was essentially an aerial telescope capable of photographing targets up to 90 miles away with extraordinary clarity. And to prove it worked, they flew Whiskey Hotel 726 out over the English Channel and photographed central London from over 60 miles away, clearly enough that you could read the time on the clock tower at Westminster. No, I'm not calling it Elizabeth Tower, it's the clock tower. Throughout 1954 and beyond, Whiskey Hotel 726 flew reconnaissance missions along the Iron Curtain. The aircraft would stay about 10 to 20 miles inside the West German border, while photographing military installations up to 30 miles inside of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all without ever crossing the border. It goes without saying that photographing Soviet military facilities from safe airspace is far safer than running a gauntlet of fighters and missiles over Russia. However, the images, although good, were not as exceptional as had first been hoped, thanks to atmospheric distortions and vibrations from those extreme focal lengths, which makes you wonder how they were able to take photos through the London smog. But Robin wasn't the only Nosy Parker intelligence mission the Canberra flew in this era. Just as a humorous aside, I was just wondering while I was writing this where the term Nosy Parker came from. Apparently it was due to a Matthew Parker who was Archbishop of Canterbury in 1559 to 1575. Apparently he had a reputation for prying into the affairs of others, hence the term Nosy Parker. I just thought it was interesting. Anyway, back to the story. So while Whiskey Hotel 726 was taking snaps of the Soviets, specially equipped Canberras from No. 192 Squadron were flying Operation Reason. These were signals intelligence missions over the Baltic, Black and Caspian Seas between 1953 and 1954. These weren't photo birds, they were flying listening posts, or if you want to put it another way, they were flying vacuum cleaners hovering around the border and hoovering up anything the Soviets let slip. Radar frequencies, intercept procedures, communication protocols, anything the Russians would rather NATO didn't know about. We'll get to the signals intelligence birds in the next video. Their biggest find came over the Caspian Sea in May 1954 when a Canberra picked up the first Western signals from a Soviet air intercept radar, the Scan-Odd system fitted to the MiG-17. The intelligence these aircraft gathered was gold dust. Now NATO finally had hard data on Soviet air defense networks, what worked, what didn't, where the gaps were. Between them, Robin and Reason gave the West eyes and ears into the Warsaw Pact without starting, obviously again, World War III. Long-range photography from one, electronic eavesdropping from the other, and critically, both operated just inside the physical country borders, if not the legal boundaries. So, of course, not as dramatic as penetrating Soviet airspace, but if you were to penetrate Mother Russia, then you'd want to do it in this beauty. By the late 1950s, the reconnaissance game was changing fast. The Soviets were building higher flying interceptors and more capable surface-to-air missile systems. American U-2s were operating above 70,000 feet, and the RAF's existing photo reconnaissance cameras, capable as they were, simply couldn't get high enough to stay out of trouble. Enter the PR-9, what some call the luxury sports version of the Canberra, which honestly wasn't far off. This wasn't just another Canberra variant with some cameras bolted on, oh no. The PR-9 was a substantial redesign with one very specific goal: altitude. English Electric handled the design work at Wharton, but the production contract went to Shorts Brothers and Harland at Belfast, who built all 23 production aircraft plus the prototype. The prototype itself had an interesting origin. Rather than building from scratch, they took an existing PR-7 Serial Whiskey Hotel 793 and modified it extensively. D. Napier and Son at Luton handled the conversion work, fitting new wings and more powerful engines. On July 8, 1955, the modified aircraft took to the air for the first time. The redesign was extensive. New Rolls-Royce Avon R827 engines, also known as the Avon 206, produced 11,250 pounds of thrust each. That's nearly double the power of the earlier Avons the Canberras used. The airframe was stretched to almost 68 feet, and the wingspan was increased by over 5 feet to 67 feet and 11 inches, and this was achieved by extending the wingtip caught inboard of the engine nacelles and adding new squared-off wingtips. The payoff? An aircraft able to reach 60,000 feet, or as the official documents coyly put it, 60,000 feet or higher. Although, in practice, 58,000 feet turned out to be a more realistic figure once the aircraft entered service. Still, that altitude performance came at a price. The PR-9 was what pilots called tender to fly. At ultra-high altitude, you operated within an extremely narrow airspeed band. Too slow and you stalled, too fast and you exceeded a maximum Mach number of 0.88, which is why the PR-9 became the only production Canberra fitted with full power-boosted flight controls and a proper autopilot. Flying it manually at altitude required constant attention, which after a while can become a bit tiresome throughout the flight, which could last many hours, and no doubt the extras were more than welcome by the crew. The pilot sat under a fighter-style canopy offset support, just like the BIA interdictor variant, giving the pilot that improved visibility compared to the older greenhouse-style canopies. The navigator occupied a separate compartment in the nose that hinged open for access. Now, this looks extremely odd when you first see it, odd and claustrophobic. Getting into the navigator's position still wasn't what you'd call comfortable, but it was better than the B-2's coal hole arrangement. Both crew members had upward firing Martin Baker ejection seats, though this safety feature came about in the worst possible way. The first production PR-9 X-Ray Hotel 129 took off on its maiden flight on July 27, 1958. Shortly afterward, the aircraft suffered a catastrophic structural failure over Liverpool Bay when the enlarged wing failed. Philip Durant, the English Electric Flight Test Observer, was in the navigator's seat, a position that on this early PR-9 didn't have an ejection seat at all, and even if he'd somehow managed to bail out, it wouldn't have mattered since he wasn't carrying a parachute. The tragedy led to an immediate redesign. The nose section was completely reworked to fit a proper ejection seat for the navigator, and this made sure that both crew members could escape in an emergency. This one death led to design changes that would protect crews over the next 46 years of PR-9 operations. It's just a shame that the same couldn't have been done for the crews of the V-bombers. The reconnaissance kit kept evolving. Cameras were swapped out, new systems bolted in, whatever the intelligence picture demanded. Initially, it was fitted with the F96 cameras with 24 or 48-inch focal length lenses, mounted either in a fan of 2 or 4 cameras, and for survey work, they used the F49 survey camera. At around 1970s, things got really interesting. The PR-9 received what was called the System 3, an electro-optic long-range oblique imaging sensor package. Now there's a mouthful. Apparently derived from the Lockheed's U-2 senior year system. This used a fixed focus 36-inch conventional camera, but with electronic enhancements. By its final years, the PR-9 could carry up to 4 different and complementary imaging systems simultaneously. The electro-optical sensor, the F95 low-level cameras, the Zeiss RMK survey camera controlled by the navigator, and the KA93 panoramic camera with its 24-inch focal length lens. The PR-9 entered service with No. 58 Squadron at RAF Witten in January 1960, and almost immediately it began what would become a long association with the Mediterranean and Middle East. No. 13 Squadron became the second unit to operate the type, stationed in aircraft in Malta, started in the summer of '61. The deployment shuffled around over the years. No. 39 Squadron took over some of the aircraft, No. 13 Squadron moved to Cyprus, then back to Malta, but the pattern remained consistent. The RAF kept PR-9s in the Mediterranean, watching Soviet warships, watching trouble spots, watching anything that needed watching. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, PR-9s photographed Russian shipping movements as part of what were called Ruby missions, sorties specifically tasked with tracking Soviet naval activity. Then you got Iraq in '61, then Yemen, anywhere which required high-altitude reconnaissance without the political complications of a U-2 overflight. No. 13 Squadron operated PR-9s from Kuching during the latter stages of the Indonesian confrontation in '64 to '65, using aircraft like X-Ray Hotel 164 to photograph Indonesian positions and movements. By 1982, the Cold War reconnaissance mission was changing, and it was when both No. 13 and No. 39 Squadron were disbanded. But 5 surviving PR-9s were used to form No. 1 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, later renamed No. 39 or 1 PRU Squadron. This small unit carried on with national and NATO reconnaissance work for another 24 years. 24 years, not bad, and the PR-9 was extremely good at what it did, that commanders actively wanted her. The missions flown by the PR-9 are many and varied. Each could make a standalone episode. These missions range from recon work over the former Yugoslavia during the Balkans conflict, civil war in Kosovo, and they even photographed the human misery of the refugees fleeing Rwanda. During the 2003 Iraq War, Operation Telek, PR-9s operated from Basra over southern Iraq. From August to September 2003, in such a short window, they managed to produce thousands of photographs and hundreds of photo mosaics and maps for British forces. And here's what really speaks to the aircraft's capability. The phrase, preferred sensor, Canberra PR-9, appeared repeatedly on reconnaissance request forms from both UK and US commanders. Preferred. So commanders on the modern battlefield with access to satellites, UAVs and every high-tech sensor system you can imagine were specifically requesting a 50-year-old aircraft because they trusted its imagery. Which says something about both the PR-9's capabilities and perhaps the limitations of some of the newer systems. The final operational deployment came in 2006 in Afghanistan. During this detachment, something happened that perfectly sums up what made the PR-9 special. A surface-to-air missile was fired at one of the aircraft, and the pilot, well, he simply outclimbed it. The PR-9's exceptional climb rate, still faster than anything else in the RAF infantry until a Typhoon arrived, meant that the missile couldn't catch it. 50 years after the prototype first flew, the design was still good enough to dodge modern weaponry. The last operational PR-9 detachment concluded on June the 23rd, 2006, when 2 aircraft returned from Afghanistan. The final PR-9 flight landed at Kemble on July the 31st, 2006. The PR-9's retirement had nothing to do with performance. The old girl could still outclimb a missile. What finally brought her down were economics of the age. The airframes were running out of pressurization cycles and there were growing fatigue cracks around the pressure bulkhead at the back of the crew compartment, problems that would have cost a fortune to fix. And then there were the ejection seats. Martin Baker still existed of course, but the particular seats fitted to the PR-9 were long out of production, and keeping them certified meant increasingly expensive inspections, bespoke parts and bills that made accountants cry. In the end, the RAF called it an economic reality. The PR-9 had become simply too costly to keep in the air, especially once newer systems like Sentinel, Reaper and satellites could provide the required intelligence by other means. So in 2006, after more than 5 decades of Canberra operations, the PR-9 finally retired, not because it couldn't do the job, but because it had become too expensive to keep doing it. It was the end of 57 years of RAF Canberra operations. 57 years. Very few aircraft can claim that sort of longevity. The B-52 and the C-130 come to mind, but those had massive production runs and continuous upgrades. The PR-9 variant, one of the ultimate evolutions of Petter's original design, flew for 46 years from the Cold War to Afghanistan. Not bad for the luxury sports model, but not all Canberras spent their careers at high altitude taking photographs. Some of them had a rather different mission, one that involved flying very low, very fast, and carrying Britain's nuclear deterrent into the heart of the Cold War. When the first Blue Danube atomic bombs arrived at RAF Wittering in late 1953, Britain had a problem. Quite a serious one actually. The RAF had nuclear weapons but no bombers capable of carrying them. The Blue Danube weighed 10,000 pounds and measured over 24 feet long. The Canberra's bomb bay simply wasn't large enough, and its range meant that it couldn't reach strategic targets deep inside the Soviet Union and return safely. The Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, those aircraft the Americans had provided Britain with as a stopgap measure, flying as Washingtons, were only meant for conventional bombing. We seem to have gotten the horse before the cart. The cart, the V-Bomber Force, the Valiant, Vulcan and Victor, was intended to solve this problem. When the Vickers Valiant finally entered service in early 1955, Britain had a strategic nuclear capability with an aircraft that had actually been designed for the mission. But that didn't make the Canberra obsolete. It gave it a different job entirely. The introduction of the V-bombers freed the Canberra to focus on what it could do brilliantly: low-level, tactical nuclear strikes across the European theatre, hitting Warsaw-packed airfields and military installations with weapons small enough to fit inside this bomb bay and targets close enough to reach on available fuel. From late 1957 onwards, Canberra B6 versions were modified for this role, and the modifications were extensive, and this produced the BI-6, the I for interdictor. It added underwing hardpoints for conventional weapons and a detachable ventral gun pack housing 4 20mm Hispano cannons, but more importantly, it was fitted with the Low Altitude Bombing System, or LABS. which is engineer speak for toss bombing, a maneuver that sounds insane until you understand why it was necessary. Here's how it worked. The Canberra would approach the target at high speed and low level, over 400 miles an hour at treetop height, making it a difficult target to track and engage. As the aircraft neared the release point, the pilot would pull up sharply into a steep climb around 4G, essentially starting a half-loop maneuver. At a precise point in the climb, the nuclear weapon would be released, continuing upward on a ballistic trajectory towards the target while the aircraft completed the maneuver and escaped in the opposite direction. The bomb would arc high over the aircraft and then fall towards the target. By the time it detonated, the Canberra would be several miles away, travelling at maximum speed in the opposite direction with terrain and distance providing at least some protection from the blast. The pilots practiced this maneuver relentlessly because getting it wrong meant flying into your own nuclear fireball, which would rather spoil your day, not to mention everyone else's. The definitive nuclear strike variant was the BI-8, which first flew on July 23, 1954 and entered service in January 1956. The BI-8 represented a radical departure from previous Canberras, featuring a completely redesigned forward fuselage with a fighter-style teardrop canopy offset to port, giving the pilot dramatically improved visibility for low-level target identification and the violent labs maneuver. The navigator sat ahead of and below the pilot at a workstation that included a swiveling seat for operations and a fixed seat for takeoff and landing. If things went wrong at low level, his options were limited to jettison the entry door and relying on a helping foot from the pilot and hoping physics would be kind. It wasn't ideal, but at 200 feet and 450 miles an hour, ejection opportunities were measured in fractions of a second anyway, so the weight savings probably made sense to someone at the Air Ministry. The BI-8 was powered by Avon Mark 109 engines producing 7,500 pounds of thrust each, of which every pound was needed considering that the maximum takeoff weight was approximately 55,000 pounds, and with full fuel it could cover 600 nautical miles out and back at low level, which doesn't sound impressive until you realise that puts most of East Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia within range from RAF Germany bases. Which was precisely the point. 72 BI-8s were built, 55 for the RAF and 17 for export to India and New Zealand, and the type proved that Petter's design, conceived for high altitude bombing, could be adapted successfully for an entirely different mission profile. But here's where things get politically complicated. Britain had nuclear weapons. Britain had aircraft capable of delivering them, but Britain didn't have enough nuclear weapons, and the ones it did have were expensive and slow to produce. In the early 1950s, Britain had only a handful of operational atomic weapons. By 1956, that number had climbed to only 14, according to records. That's 14 nuclear weapons to deter the entire Soviet Union. The groundwork for nuclear cooperation had begun under Churchill, but it was Anthony Eden who formally approached President Eisenhower with a request that was both pragmatic and slightly embarrassing. Could the Americans supply nuclear weapons for British bombers until sufficient British weapons were available? The answer was yes, though it came with conditions. This arrangement became known as Project E, and it fundamentally shaped the Canberra's nuclear role for roughly the next 12 to 16 years. Under the agreement, finalized in 1957, the United States would provide tactical nuclear weapons stored on British bases under American custody. American personnel would handle all the storage, maintenance, and readiness tasks. The weapons would be held in a secure storage area on the same basis as the bombers. But here's the critical detail. Release required presidential authorization. Britain's independent deterrent wasn't exactly independent, though to be fair, nobody really advertised that particular nuance. The first aircraft equipped with Project E weapons were Canberra squadrons based in RAF Germany, the front line of NATO's tactical air power. From 1960s onwards, these squadrons were fitted out to carry the American Mark 7 tactical nuclear weapon, a 1,600-pound bomb with yields ranging from 8 to tens of kilotons, dependent on configuration. The Mark VII was a revelation compared to the earlier weapons, small enough to fit in the camera's bomb bay, light enough not to compromise performance, and powerful enough to destroy a Soviet airfield or military installation with a single strike. Perfect for a tactical nuclear war, if such a thing could ever be called perfect. From the early 1960s, the newer B-43 nuclear bomb began to replace the Mark VII in some roles, which was more suitable for laydown delivery, which meant it could be dropped at low level with a parachute retarder, giving the aircraft time to escape before detonation. The B-43 remained in service with RAF Germany Canberra squadrons until 1972, when the last Canberra bombers were finally retired from RAF service and replaced by Phantom FGR-2s in the tactical nuclear role. But RAF Germany wasn't the only theatre where Canberras carried nuclear weapons. 3 squadrons based on Cyprus at RAF Akaturi and 1 squadron at RAF Tenga in Singapore were armed with British-owned Redbeard tactical nuclear weapons. Redbeard was Britain's own tactical nuclear bomb, considerably smaller and lighter than the Blue Danube with a yield of around 15 kilotons. It entered service in 1961 and could be delivered using the same lab's toss bombing technique. The Cyprus and Singapore squadrons flew B-15 and B-16 variants, upgraded B-6 conversions strengthened for low-level operations and specifically modified for labs delivery. When dealing with Redbeard in Cyprus, the navigator had an additional duty that was both technically demanding and slightly terrifying. He was required to carry out last-minute loading of the physics package, the fissile core, into the weapon before flight. This delicate procedure involved lifting the flask containing the core, carefully offering it up to the weapon, mounted in the bomb bay, and locking it into place. The crews affectionately called it playing gynecologist to an elephant or inserting the suppository, which gives you some sense of how they felt about inserting plutonium cores into nuclear weapons. Health and safety was evidently more of a suggestion than a requirement. But by 1960, the nuclear-capable Canberra force had reached full operational status, and with it came a posture that would define Cold War deterrence: quick reaction alert. The QRA concept was straightforward enough. At least 1 aircraft from each squadron was maintained at full combat readiness. These crews had to start engines, taxi, and get into the air within 15 minutes of an alert, although they were expected to be airborne in less time than that and on their way to their Warsaw Pact targets to deliver the good news. At the height of the Canberra's operational capability, RAF Germany maintained BI-8s on alert around the clock every day of the year. QRA aircraft were kept in wired-off compounds with security provided jointly by RAF and American military police. Such was the shared nature of the nuclear mission. And here's where that arrangement gets particularly interesting. Access to the American-owned nuclear weapons was governed by what was called the two-man concept. The Canberra crews were accompanied in the QRA compound by a United States Air Force alert duty officer, usually a lieutenant, who provided half of the two-man team necessary to access and handle the weapon. The American officer held the code. The British crew held the aircraft and the mission. Neither could proceed without the other, which was either a brilliant example of cooperation or a subtle reminder that Britain's independent deterrent had an American veto built into it. Probably both, depending on your perspective. QRA duty was tested frequently at no notice, day or night, by Bomber Command HQ at High Wycombe. The alert would come over the tannoy system, and crews would race to the aircraft, engines would roar to life, and the clock would start ticking. Squadrons took considerable pride in their scramble times, and there was inevitable rivalry to see who could get airborne fastest when the command came. Training for the nuclear mission was exhaustive. The primary QRA target was studied religiously by crews in regular sessions in the Operations Wing Vault, a secure room where classified targeting materials were kept. The day before a QRA duty started, it was a mandatory study day where crews would review routes, targets, terrain, defences and abort procedures, because if the alert came for real, there'd be no time for questions. From what I could gather, the targets themselves were confined almost entirely to tactical airfields and military installations in Warsaw Pact satellite countries like East Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia. Targets close enough to reach, important enough to justify a nuclear strike, and far enough from Soviet Union territory that Britain wouldn't be directly attacking Russia itself, which might have made escalation marginally less likely, though marginally less likely is doing quite a bit of work in that sentence. The nuclear strike force maintained this posture throughout the 1960s, through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through countless alerts and scrambles, through periods of heightened tensions when the likelihood of war seemed genuinely possible. And they never flew the mission for real, which was, of course, the entire point. Deterrence isn't about fighting nuclear war. It's about making the prospect of starting one so terrifying that nobody does. By maintaining the aircraft on constant alert, and by demonstrating that we had the capability to launch within minutes, and the constant practicing for the missions relentlessly, Britain created a credible threat that the Soviet planners they had to account for in any war scenario. Bomber Command's last conventional Canberra squadrons stood down in September 1961, but Germany, Cyprus and Singapore-based squadrons continued in the nuclear strike role. The squadrons based in Cyprus and one of the RAF Germany squadrons disbanded in 1969, with the Singapore-based unit following in 1970. The three remaining RAF Germany units, by now flying BI-8s with B-43 nuclear bombs instead of the older Mark 7s, remained operational until 1972, making them the last Canberra bombers in RAF service. When they finally stood down, they'd been sitting in the nuclear alert for over a decade, maintaining constant readiness to execute a mission they'd trained for thousands of times, but thankfully never had to fly. In my opinion, the Canberra's nuclear role doesn't get the attention of the V-bomber strategic deterrent. Probably because tactical nuclear weapons sound less dramatic than hydrogen bombs carried by Delta or Crescent Wing bombers flying at low level. But in many ways, the Canberra force was more immediately relevant to NATO's defence strategy. These were the aircraft that would have been sent in first in any European conflict, delivering strikes to take the wind out of the sails of a Warsaw Pact offensive before it could overwhelm NATO's conventional forces. They were, quite literally, the time it took to boil a kettle away from starting a nuclear war. And we have to also remember the crews who flew them, and they lived with that knowledge every day they sat alert, studying the targets they hoped they'd never see and practicing maneuvers they hoped they'd never fly in anger. But perhaps its greatest achievement in the nuclear role was simply being ready, day after day, year after year, maintaining a credible deterrent that helped keep the Cold War, well, cold. But not every Canberra mission carried the weight of nuclear war. Some carried something even more immediately more dangerous to the crews. While reconnaissance cameras photographed positions over enemy territory, other crews flew missions that were arguably more dangerous into environments where the air itself was lethal. The Canberra's exceptional high-altitude performance didn't just make it a military asset, it turned it into Britain's primary scientific tool at the dawn of the nuclear age, and crews who flew these missions faced risks that had nothing to do with enemy action. The earliest and perhaps most hazardous of these specialised roles began with Operation Totem in 1953, following Britain's atomic test shots in the remote desert of South Australia. Modified Canberra B-2s were assigned to fly directly through atomic clouds to collect radiological samples, a task the crews understood was extraordinarily dangerous. To achieve this, a third crew member, the Observer, controlled a unique collection system where the starboard wingtip fuel tank was converted into a Mark III, very important, the Mark III sampling duct holding filter papers designed to trap nuclear debris as the aircraft flew through the mushroom cloud. Operating under the codename Operation Hotbox, which was grimly appropriate, the crews faced extreme peril that became horrifyingly clear after the first totem shot. The pilots absorbed dangerous levels of radiation during their sampling runs, enough that authorities immediately barred them from flying additional missions. The radiation measuring equipment they carried provided some indication of exposure levels, but the long-term health effects of flying through freshly detonated atomic clouds weren't fully understood, and the crews were essentially serving as test subjects themselves. A few years later, the Canberra was pressed into even more ambitious service during Operation Grapple. This was Britain's hydrogen bomb trials conducted at Christmas Island between 1957 and 1958. RAF No. 76 Squadron flew B-6s to sample the thermonuclear mushroom clouds, but they immediately encountered a problem. The thermonuclear clouds from hydrogen bombs rose far higher than those from the atomic weapons, way above the Canberra's standard operating ceiling of 54,000 feet. The solution they found was dramatic. The B-6s were fitted with the powerful Napier double Scorpion rocket motor, essentially strapping a rocket engine to a jet bomber to boost it high enough to reach the sampling altitude just above 60,000 feet. The double Scorpion modification was crude but effective, though the crews risked entering clouds where, as one account diplomatically noted, the radiation measuring equipment was not always accurate, which is another way of saying the crews had limited confidence in knowing just how much radiation they were absorbing. But joking aside, it must be noted that the crews who flew these missions deserve particular recognition. They were flying into poorly understood dangers that wouldn't be fully appreciated until decades later, when the long-term health effects became clearer. Further Canberras were fitted out to be used for meteorological research, and although these scientific Canberras weren't glamorous and didn't set any speed records, they did contribute enormously to Britain's nuclear weapons program and atmospheric research. Once again, proof that good basic design could be adapted to almost anything. In January 1950, English Electric's chairman, Sir George Nelson, made a decision that would prove considerably more than its weight in diplomatic goodwill. Sir Nelson named the company's new jet bomber Canberra after Australia's capital city. It wasn't sentiment, or at least not just sentiment, it was a sales strategy, and it worked brilliantly. Australia became the first export customer, and what followed was one of the most successful export campaigns in British aviation history, a jet bomber designed by a company with virtually no aircraft design experience, ending up in service with over 15 air forces across 4 continents. The Australians didn't just buy British-built aircraft, they went further. Through the government aircraft factories, they license-built their own variant, the Canberra B-20 or Mark 20, assembling 48 aircraft with modifications including a redesigned leading edge and increased fuel capacity through integral fuel wing tanks. But Australia was just the beginning. The real validation, the deal that made everyone sit up and take notice, came from an unexpected direction: the United States. During the Korean War, the US Air Force found itself with a problem. Their piston-powered bombers were obsolete. The war had proven that decisively enough. They needed jet bombers, and they needed them quickly. Several American manufacturers had designs on offer, but after extensive evaluation, including a rather famous demonstration at Andrews Air Force Base where Roland Beamont comprehensively outflew the competition, even being scolded by one Air Force official who said, "This is an Air Force trial, not a Farnborough show." Regardless, the USAF were impressed enough to make a decision that was almost unprecedented in post-war American military procurement. They chose the British design. The license agreement with Glenelg Martin Company resulted in the production of 403 Martin B-57 Canberras, a truly impressive number. Martin evolved the design considerably, incorporating a tandem 2-seat cockpit that the RAF would later admit was superior to their own fishbowl arrangement, and fitting powerful Wright J65 engines, which were license-built versions of the British Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire. The Martin B-57 quickly became its own distinct family of aircraft, but it could all be traced back to that elegant design that had emerged from Preston. And here's the thing about that deal, it wasn't just about aircraft. This deal proved that Britain could still produce world-class military equipment that even the Americans wanted, which in the 1950s was no small achievement given the rather lopsided nature of the so-called special relationship. We'll cover the B-57 in greater detail in the next video in this series on the Canberra. So, India. India became the third largest Canberra operator globally. They bought 54 tropicalized BI-58 bomber variants derived from the BI-8 plus 8 PR-57 reconnaissance aircraft. The tropicalization modifications weren't trivial. They included improved cooling systems, environmental protection for avionics, all the engineering work needed to operate reliably in India's punishing climate where temperatures and humidity could turn delicate electronics into expensive paperweights. South Africa received new-build BI-12 intruder variants, with the very last Canberra airframe built in the UK being a BI-12 for the South African Air Force. There's something rather poignant about that. The final aircraft rolling off a British production line destined for another country entirely. Argentina acquired 10 refurbished Canberras plus 2 trainers, all fitted with additional avionics and underwing pylons. Those aircraft would eventually find themselves in a rather uncomfortable situation in 1982, which we'll cover later on, and the list goes on. New Zealand, Peru, Rhodesia, Ecuador, Ethiopia, France, Sweden, Venezuela, West Germany, Chile. Over 15 countries in total operate in Canberras and roles ranging from high-altitude reconnaissance to low-level strike, from nuclear deterrence to counterinsurgency operations. By 1962, royalties from licensed production and exports had reached £164 million. Transformational money for a post-war British aerospace industry desperately needing to prove it could still compete. 901 Canberras were manufactured in the UK. Add the 403 American-built B-57s and the 48 Australian-built Mark 20s, and you get a total of 1,352 aircraft, if my maths is correct. That's more than any other British jet bomber of the era. The massive production requirements led to extensive subcontracting across the industry. Firms like Avro, Handley Page, Short Brothers all built Canberras under license, spreading the work and expertise across the sector. More importantly, the continuous demand from overseas customers sustained a lucrative refurbishment and modification program at factories like Salisbury for over 2 decades. And it kept people employed and it kept expertise alive. The aircraft that had begun as a response to a 1944 Air Ministry specification for a high-altitude bomber became a global phenomenon, serving longer in more varied roles than almost any other combat aircraft of its generation. It was the right aircraft at the right time, and the world saw that. But the real measure of the Canberra success wasn't production numbers or export deals. The real measure was what happened when these aircraft went to war. Before we move on, there's something important to say. The Canberra's international story wasn't just one of export deals, engineering triumphs, and flags painted on tail fins. These aircraft went on to serve in real conflicts flown by real people. And as we head into the next chapter, where the Canberra story takes a darker turn in the South Atlantic, it's worth stating plainly. This is not about glorifying war. This is not about turning combat into entertainment. It is about understanding history and about recognizing the men who flew and sometimes fell in machines designed long before any of them imagined the circumstances they would one day face. Pilots, navigators, ground crew, British, Argentine, and anyone else who ever strapped into a Canberra. They all carried the same mixture of courage, fear, duty and hope. They were professionals doing the jobs their nations asked of them. So as we move from international success to the next chapter that I titled Brother versus Brother for a reason, to remember that behind every sortie and every statistic are human beings whose memories deserve respect. On April 2nd, 1982, Argentine Marines landed on a cold, wind-battered archipelago in an invasion known as Operation Rosario. The Falkland Islands, or Las Malvinas, dependent on which map you preferred, had been British territory since 1833, though Argentina had never ceased claiming them. The island's 1,800 residents were almost entirely of British descent, spoke English, and had no desire whatsoever to become Argentine citizens. Argentina saw it differently. For generations, Argentine schoolchildren had been taught that Las Malvinas were stolen territory, wrongfully occupied by a fading imperial power. The island sat 300 miles from the Argentine coast and 8,000 miles from Britain, a geographic absurdity that even British observers sometimes acknowledge when looking at the globe. By 1982, Argentina was ruled by a military junta that had governed since 1976. General Leopoldo Galtieri and his colleagues presided over what became known as the Guerra Sucia, the Dirty War, essentially a campaign of state terror that had disappeared thousands. The economy was in freefall, inflation was out of control, and unrest was growing. The junta needed a distraction, and they needed it urgently. Recovering Las Malvinas promised to unify the nation, restore pride, and perhaps rescue the regime. Britain, meanwhile, had been drawing down its overseas commitments for decades. Hong Kong negotiations were underway, and the Royal Navy was shrinking. HMS Endurance, the light ice patrol vessel representing Britain's presence in the South Atlantic, was close to being withdrawn. The junta concluded that Britain would not fight for a remote set of islands many British citizens would struggle to locate on a map. They were tragically wrong. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher faced a clear choice: accept the invasion and suffer political collapse, or send a military task force thousands of miles south to retake the islands by force. She chose force. Within days, a hastily assembled armada began departing Portsmouth and Gibraltar. It was the largest British naval deployment since World War II and would require 3 weeks simply to reach the South Atlantic. Argentina enjoyed the advantage of proximity. Its air bases were only 400 miles from the Falklands. Britain would be operating at the outer edge of logistical possibility. One lost carrier, one sunk logistics ship, and the entire operation might fail. But Britain held the edge in training, equipment, and critically modern missiles and aircraft. As the British task force made its way south, the Fuerza Aérea Argentina prepared for the coming fight. The Argentine Air Force was a mixed bag: A4 Skyhawks, Mirage fighters, Dagger interceptors, Pucara ground attack aircraft, and 5 Navy Super Entendards carrying Exocet missiles that would prove devastating. Among this patchwork force were 10 English Electric Canberra bombers. In the early 1970s, Argentina had taken delivery of 10 B-62 bombers and 2 T-64 trainers, essentially refurbished B-2s with upgraded avionics and underwing pylons, replacing the elderly Avro Lincolns that had somehow continued flying bombing missions into the 1960s. But by 1982, the fleet was undeniably aging. Argentina had ordered 2 additional aircraft in 1981, but both were still in the UK when the war began, and once the fighting broke out, it wasn't likely that the contract would be honoured. When Argentine troops seized the islands, the Canberras were based at Trello, roughly 670 miles from the Falklands. 8 aircraft were deployable, not a decisive force, but usable. The first Canberra mission launched on May 1st, 1982. The same day, a lone RAF Vulcan carried out Operation Black Buck 1. 6 B-62s from No. 1 Escuadrón de Bombardeo departed Trello in 2 flights of 3. The mission profile was high, low, high, meaning high altitude transit, then descending to 15 to 20 meters above the water to avoid radar detection, and then climbing again for the return. Canberra B-110 never returned. It was intercepted by a Sea Harrier of No. 801 Squadron. An AIM-9L Sidewinder, one of the new all-aspect variants, tracked the Canberra and detonated. The pilot, Teniente Eduardo de Ibanez, and navigator, Teniente Mario Gonzalez, ejected over the Atlantic. Neither survived. Argentina had just lost 10% of its Canberra force on the first day of operations. British assessments were blunt. The Canberra was a limited threat, comparatively sluggish in manoeuvring, subsonic speed, and a radar signature that made it easy to track. It could carry a respectable bomb load and operate at challenging altitudes, but against modern fighters armed with advanced missiles, it was simply outclassed. The Argentines understood this quickly and adapted. Of the 54 sorties flown by Argentine Canberras during the war, 36 were bombing missions and 22 of those took place at night. The logic was simple. The Sea Harrier's Blue Fox radar struggled to detect and track low-flying targets, and at night in the darkness their odds of survival dramatically improved. But it also meant they could not see their targets. But what choice did they have? Either suffer disastrous daylight losses or adapt to night ops. So the squadron shifted to night operations, which were initially flown at around 500 feet using radar altimeter, then later at 40,000 feet. Although, unsurprisingly, their accuracy was more a matter of hope than precision. In total, the Canberras dropped an estimated 18,000 pounds of bombs, mostly around ground positions near Port Stanley and San Carlos Bay. On June 13, 1982, Canberra B-108 of the 2nd Bomber Group took off. The mission? Bombard British ground forces from 39,000 feet, above the reach of most shoulder-launched missiles and theoretically beyond the Sea Harrier's comfortable intercept zone, but not beyond the reach of HMS Cardiff's Sea Dart missile. Designed for long-range, high-altitude engagements, the Sea Dart could reach around 60,000 feet, and the missile struck. But the Canberra was not immediately destroyed, but instead damaged the aircraft. The pilot, Captain Roberto Pastran, fought at the controls, buying time for his navigator and best friend, Captain Fernando Casado, to eject. But when he was at 10,000 feet, he said to Casado, "I have to leave you," and then he ejected. Pastran was captured by British forces. His navigator, Captain Fernando Casado, perished in the crash. B-108 was the last Argentine aircraft shot down in the Falklands War, and on the same day, Argentina effectively conceded the conflict. Later that day, B-109 completed the final Canberra sortie, and then the fleet stood down. 2 aircraft lost, 20% of the force. While Argentina's Canberras were flying over the islands, the RAF faced a pressing problem. They needed timely, high-resolution reconnaissance of Argentine positions around Port Stanley. Vulcans could carry improvised camera fits, but the 12-hour round trip meant any images were already outdated by the time they arrived. What the task force needed was a high-altitude, long-range reconnaissance platform. And they had one. Well, sort of. The Canberra PR-9. By 1982, the PR-9 was the final Canberra variant still in RAF service for its original design role. And it had what the task force needed. It could reach nearly 60,000 feet and was at the time fitted with the superb B camera system adapted from the Lockheed U-2. So it had the altitude and the kit, but not quite the long range needed. The Falkland Islands were just out of reach. The nearest British base was Ascension Island, roughly 3,800 miles from the islands, far beyond the PR-9's unrefueled range. Unlike the Vulcans, the PR-9 lacked an air-to-air refueling probe, and modifying one was not feasible in the time available. So someone proposed an unconventional solution: Chile. Relations between Chile and Argentina were tense. The two had nearly gone to war in 1978 over the Beagle Channel. Pinochet's government viewed Argentina with deep suspicion. This made Chile a potential, if discreet, ally. The plan that emerged was bold. Britain would supply 2 PR-9s to the Chilean Air Force. Officially, they would be Chilean aircraft flown by Chilean crews. Unofficially, RAF personnel would conduct covert reconnaissance over the Falklands from Chilean bases, collecting imagery ahead of the British landings. Crews were chosen and the aircraft prepared. Everything was ready. And then politics intervened. If an RAF-flown PR-9 was shot down while operating from Chilean soil, the diplomatic fallout would have been explosive. Chile hesitated, Britain hesitated, and leaks to the press sealed the plan's fate. The operation was cancelled, and the PR-9s reached Belize on standby but went no further. Chile did assist Britain indirectly, most notably through a powerful radar installation near the Argentine border that tracked Argentine air movements and passed the data to the UK through secure channels. By then, the US had also begun supplying satellite imagery, reducing the need for a risky reconnaissance campaign from Chilean bases. 3 PR-9s, X-Ray Hotel 166, X-Ray Hotel 167 and X-Ray Hotel 173 were eventually delivered to Chile in late 1982, long after the war ended. The 2 aircraft that Argentina had ordered and paid for before the war were never delivered, and from what I could gather, they were given to Chile, but this is not 100% confirmed. The Chilean PR-9s remained in service for years, their missions largely classified. What exactly they photographed and for whose benefit is a question that probably won't be answered until the files are declassified, if they ever are. The Falklands War made clear that the Canberra's time as a frontline bomber was over. Argentine crews flew bravely but were technologically outmatched. The RAF's PR-9s nearly played a dramatic covert role, but diplomacy and caution prevented it. Argentina's Canberra fleet never recovered. Combat losses, spare part embargoes, and a post-war landing accident reduced the operational force to 5 aircraft. The type lingered in Argentine service for another decade, but the writing was on the wall. For Britain, the Falklands was a turning point in thinking about power projection and the kind of capabilities needed for limited wars in distant theatres. The Canberra PR-9 would continue flying reconnaissance missions for another 24 years. The design still had operational value even when the bomber variants had long since retired. The Falklands War was the last time Canberras dropped bombs in anger, in a conflict that would have been unimaginable to Teddy Petter and his team. Once again, British-designed aircraft fighting each other on both sides of a war. Ultimately, the bomber was finished. The reconnaissance platform would keep flying. And that, finally, is where, for the time being, the Canberra's war story ends. And there we have it, for now. From a Preston Garage sketch in 1944 to a final sortie over Afghanistan in 2006, 57 years of continuous service, the English Electric Canberra bomber, trainer, spy plane, nuclear striker, cloud sampler, record breaker, export superstar. An aircraft that fought in Suez, Malaya, Vietnam, Africa, India and the Falklands, wars on every continent except Antarctica, and I wouldn't rule it out if somebody had asked nicely. It outlasted the V-bombers, it outlasted the Cold War and the Soviets it was built to fight. It even outlasted the company that made it. Today you can find Canberras in museums from Cosford to Delhi, from Amberley to East Kirkby. Whiskey Echo 139, the Christchurch race winner, sits pride of place in the Royal Air Force Museum, Hendon, and I expect and hope she'll be there long after I'm gone, inspiring the next generation of pilots and engineers. Teddy Petter's simple, modular, high-flying jet, conceived when the world was tearing itself apart, became one of the longest-serving combat aircraft in history. Now, all the ladies have retired, but every Canberra still tells the same story of an aircraft that changed with the times, outlasting them all, and did it all with class while sipping tea at 50,000 feet. Right. Thank you very much for making it this far, and deep breath. So before you go to decompress with a cup of tea, please remember to grab your copy of Raid Shadow Legends using the link below to see what all the fuss is about. I'm still playing, so you might find me on there. Remember, I am Aviation Joe on that game. So yeah, give it a go. I'm actually enjoying it. What can I tell you? It's nice to just switch off for 5 minutes whenever I get to 5 minutes. But anyway, so look, I hope you've enjoyed this chapter. It's been hell of a thing to make. Look, I know we spend a lot of time talking about the metal, the specs, the engines, the records, but every time I walk past Whiskey Echo 139 at the museum, in fact, I was there this morning, I was trying to record a piece for this video, but there were lots of kids there screaming, so I didn't actually get to record the video. So anyway, so every time I walk past Whiskey Echo 139 at the museum, I do think about these people. I think about Burton and Gannon flying 23 hours to Christchurch, betting their lives on the fuel calculations and engine reliability. The lads sit in nuclear alert in Germany, 15 minutes from World War III, day after day, praying that call would never come. Think about Roy Urquhart Pullen, who didn't make it out of Syria, Tenente de Ibanez, Tenente Gonzalez, who ejected over the South Atlantic and never came home. Captain Fernando Casado, whose camera was hit by that sea dart on the last day of the Falklands War. British, Argentine, Indian, Australian, it doesn't matter. They're all flying the same aircraft, doing the same terrifying jobs, facing the same risks. Young men, most of them barely older than my kids. And whether they were dropping bombs on Port Stanley or sitting nuclear alert in Cyprus or flying for atomic clouds over Christmas Island, they were doing jobs that could kill them just as easily as any enemy could. So yeah, I love the engineering. I love that Teddy Petter built something in a Preston garage that flew for 57 years, but mostly I respect the hell out of anybody who flew them. All of them. Right, that's it from me. I'll see you next time.